Emily grew up in a small town in rural Ohio where everyone knew each other, and the quiet streets were lined with tall trees and well-kept lawns. For many, living there meant safety and belonging, a sense of comfort in seeing the same faces every day. For Emily, however, that quiet life wasn't enough. She felt like a bird trapped in a cage. She longed for more than the limited horizon that small town had to offer. The house where Emily grew up was an old wooden building, surrounded by a garden that her father John took care of with great dedication. John was a committed man, rigid in his routine and disciplined. He had built almost everything in that house with his own hands, which reflected his personality. Someone who believed in the power of effort and hard work. As a carpenter, he spent hours in his workshop, hammering and sawing wood, creating furniture with impeccable precision. John was never a man of many words. He was the type who showed affection through actions, fixing Emily's old bicycle, painting her room in the colors she chose, or building a treehouse for her when she was 10. Despite these demonstrations, he never said "I love you," which often left Emily doubting her father's feelings. For her, it was as if there was an invisible wall between them, an empty space he didn't know how to fill. Since childhood, Emily had always been different from what John expected. While he valued stability and predictability, she dreamed of adventures, travels, and freedom. Emily loved to draw and spent hours alone creating fantastic worlds in her sketchbooks. For her, drawing was an escape, a way to express what words could not. She imagined herself someday leaving that small town, going somewhere where her art would be valued, where she could meet people who shared her passion. On the other hand, John expected Emily to stay close, helping with the family business and living a life he considered safe and stable. He knew how difficult the world could be out there and wanted to protect his daughter from dangers and uncertainties. Thus, the love that John had for Emily turned into control, a desperate attempt to keep her close and away from any risk. When Emily turned 18, the conflicts began to intensify. She talked about going to art school, about traveling far and exploring the world, while John just frowned and withdrew into silence. He never openly said he was against her plans, but he also never supported them. When Emily spoke excitedly about her drawings, her ideas, and what she could do beyond that town, John would merely mumble something about getting a real career that could pay the bills. Each of these small responses, even though intended to be cautious, felt like a knife to Emily's heart. Their relationship was like a rope constantly stretched, ready to snap. There were days when everything seemed fine, when John would call her to help in the carpentry shop, teaching her how to sand a piece of wood or how to measure a perfect angle. In those moments, she saw the father who loved her, who cared. But on other days, everything seemed to fall apart when they talked about the future. John could not accept the idea of his daughter, the only person he truly loved, leaving to live a life he did not understand and could not control. Then came that rainy night that would change everything. Emily was 23, and after years of saving money and working temporary jobs, she had finally received an offer to work as an assistant to an illustrator in New York. It wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity, the chance she'd always dreamed of to leave and do something with her life. When she entered the living room to share the news with her father, her heart was full of expectation, but also fear. She knew he wouldn't react well, but she needed to try. John was sitting in the living room, reading a newspaper while the rain softly hit the window. Emily stood there for a moment, trying to find the right words, until she finally decided to speak. "Dad, I got an opportunity in New York. I'll be working with an illustrator, and I'm moving next month," Emily said, her voice trembling but trying to sound confident. John slowly lowered the newspaper, looking at her as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. For a moment, there was only silence. Emily saw the look of shock transform into something colder, something she recognized: disappointment. "New York?" John shook his head slowly. "Emily, this is crazy. New York is not the place for you. You have a life here. You have security here." She felt the anger rising, anger that had built up over years of small disappointments and repressed dreams. "Security? Dad, I don't want that security. I want more than this. I want to do something that actually means something to me." Ooh. John stood up, his expression hardening, the lines on his face deepening. And what do you think you're going to find out there? Do you think the world is easy? That being an artist is going to pay your bills? That's not a life, Emily. That's a dream. And it's a dream that will lead you nowhere? Those words were the last straw. Emily, tired of trying to convince her father of her dreams, let her anger take over. You never believed in me. Never. You always wanted me to be like you, to stay trapped here. But I'm not you, Dad. I'm not going to live this life. John, visibly hurt, took a deep breath and responded, each word coming out like daggers. If that's what you want, go. But don't come back when you regret it. You're making a choice, and I can't stop you. But I won't be here to pick up the pieces when it doesn't work. Emily, with tears in her eyes, simply nodded. She packed her bags that same night without looking back, leaving her father standing in the doorway, his figure just a shadow against the hallway light. She drove away, her heart pounding and her vision blurred by tears. Despite the adrenaline and anger she felt, there was also a void, a pain she didn't know how to heal. No matter how much she wanted to follow her dreams, it wasn't easy to leave behind the one person who had been her family, who had been her world, no matter how complicated it was. John, on his part, stood at the door for a while, staring at the open space until he closed it with a heavy heart. He returned to the living room, sat down in his armchair, but the newspaper no longer mattered. The house felt empty, even though the furniture, the sound of the rain outside, and the smell of wood were still there. Without Emily, it was as if the home had lost its essence. In the days and months that followed, John buried himself in work, using the noise of the tools and the saw to drown out the silence that now filled his house. He never told anyone what had happened. When someone asked about Emily, he would simply say she was in New York, as if it were a temporary visit. It was easier than admitting she might never come back. Emily, now living in New York, was too busy trying to survive. The city was everything she had imagined and more. Vibrant, full of opportunities, but also harsh and exhausting. She went through ups and downs, had moments of pure exhilaration when her drawings were noticed, but also nights of deep loneliness, wishing she could call her father and hear his voice, hear that he was proud of her. But pride always stopped her, and in a way she knew her father was the same, too proud to give in, to extend his hand. The years went by, each of them living with the weight of the distance, both pretending to themselves that they were fine. But deep down, they both knew that the distance was a wound that never fully healed. Every Christmas without a phone call, every birthday without a card, the emptiness between them seemed to grow. They both missed each other, but neither knew how to break the silence they had built. That wound was deep, an absence that hurt more than any words spoken on the night Emily left. But life, with its unexpected twists, was about to change everything, forcing them to face what had been left unfinished. And perhaps, finally, find a way to forgive each other. It was an ordinary afternoon in New York, and Emily was immersed in her routine. Her makeshift studio in her small apartment was a mess of colored pencils, paints, and papers scattered everywhere. She was working on an important project for a children's book publisher, trying to find the perfect combination of colors that would bring one of the pages to life. The work was challenging, but also her source of joy and escape. It was an opportunity to showcase her art, to prove to herself that she was on the right path. The sound of sirens and car horns from the street came through the window, a constant background noise that no longer bothered her, but rather made her feel like part of the intense life of the metropolis. Emily was so engrossed that she didn't even notice her phone vibrating on the table. When the screen lit up again, she looked away from her paints and saw it was a call from an unknown number with the area code of her hometown, Ohio. She hesitated. Normally, she would ignore a call like that, assuming it was some sort of sales call. But something about that number made her reach over and pick up the phone. Maybe it was curiosity or simply a strange feeling in her stomach that she couldn't ignore. She answered. "Hello," Emily said, her voice a little hesitant. "Emily Johnson?" a female voice responded. "This is from Ohio Hospital. I'm sorry to call like this, but we've been trying to get in touch with you regarding your father, John Johnson." Emily's world seemed to freeze for a second. The words hospital and father seemed to float in the air, not really connecting with reality. She blinked as if she needed a moment to understand what she was hearing. "My father?" Emily finally managed to ask, her voice cracking a bit. "Yeah," the woman on the other end responded. "Your father is here, and the situation is quite critical. He had a serious heart issue, and frankly, we're not sure how much time he has left. We thought you'd want to come if possible." Emily could barely hear the rest of the conversation. The woman's voice sounded distant, like an echo, while her mind filled with memories and a whirlwind of emotions. The thought of her father, John, had always been that of someone strong, unbreakable, someone who would never need help. And now he was sick. The word critical sounded particularly heavy. The reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. Her father could be dying, and she wasn't there. They weren't okay. There were so many unresolved things between them, so many words left unsaid. She thanked the nurse almost mechanically and hung up. Emily sat there looking at the phone in her hands, the room suddenly feeling like it was closing in on her. Her heart was pounding, and a sense of suffocation took over. Tears started to fill her eyes, but she took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She felt a desperation she couldn't control, a fear so deep it almost paralyzed her. And above all, she felt an immense guilt. How many times had she thought about calling him? How many times had she written messages only to delete them before sending? She always convinced herself it was too late, that he would never forgive her for leaving. But now, as she sat on the floor of her studio, the reality was clear. She might never have another chance to see him, to resolve what had been left unfinished, to say the words she so badly wanted to. "I'm sorry, Dad, I miss you." Emily swallowed hard, knowing what she had to do. She had no choice. After a few minutes of paralysis, Emily got up and started moving. She took a suitcase from the closet and began throwing in some clothes. Her mind was blank, just the distant noise of fast thoughts. "I need to see him. Will he even want to see me? What if I'm too late?" Doubt and fear consumed her, but she knew she couldn't just sit there. She had to try. With her suitcase packed, Emily grabbed the first taxi to the train station. The trip to Ohio would take hours, and every minute seemed like an eternity. On the train, she sat near the window, looking at the passing scenery. The skyscrapers of New York soon gave way to fields and suburban areas, but all she saw was her father's face. Their last words echoed in her mind like a cruel mantra. "If that's what you want, go, but don't come back when you regret it." Did he still feel that way? Would he understand why she had done what she did? She remembered when she was little, and John used to take her to the park on Saturdays. He would push her on the swing, and Emily would laugh, asking to go higher. He was her hero, the strong father who would always protect her. Remembering those things now felt even more painful. What had happened to that father? How had they come to the point of not even talking to each other? Time seemed to crawl. Emily could barely eat or sleep during the journey. With every stop the train made, her heart would pound a little harder, as if she were getting closer to a truth she didn't want to face. She tried not to think of the worst, but it was impossible. What if her father was already gone? What if all that was left was the guilt for the time they had lost? Finally, the train arrived at the small station in her hometown. Emily got off with quick steps, her heart pounding more fiercely with every move. The familiar landscape brought a flood of memories. The convenience store where she used to buy candy as a child, the town square where year-end events were held, the street that led to the house where she grew up. Everything seemed the same, and yet strange. She hadn't visited that town in 5 years. Everything was intact, but Emily's world had changed so much that it felt like a different town, one she no longer connected with. Taking a taxi, she finally made her way to the hospital. Every mile seemed like an eternity, an agonizing wait to finally face whatever awaited her. She took deep breaths several times, trying to prepare herself for what was to come. But how could anyone prepare for something like that? How do you prepare to see your own father vulnerable and weakened after so much time apart? The hospital was an old brick building, with large windows showing glimpses of the cold, white light inside. Emily got out of the taxi and stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds, looking at the building. Her legs were trembling, and the fear of finding John in a state beyond recovery made her hesitate. Still, before she could convince herself otherwise, she forced herself to enter. At the reception, The attendant gave her a polite but distant smile. Emily could barely focus on the instructions the receptionist gave her about how to find her father's room. Her mind was only focused on one thing: getting to him. She thanked the receptionist with a nod and headed to the elevator, pressing the button for the indicated floor. The elevator rose too slowly, each floor taking an eternity. When she finally reached the correct floor, Emily stepped out quickly, searching for the number she had been given. Room 312. The corridor was long and silent, the sound of her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. When she reached the door, she stopped, her heart pounding, her hands sweaty. What would she find on the other side of that door? What would it be like to see her father after so long? She felt like a lost child, desperately wanting her father's comfort, but also afraid that he wouldn't accept her anymore. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she caught a partial glimpse of the room. What she saw was not the father she knew. John was lying in bed, with tubes attached to him, paler and much thinner than she remembered. His eyes were closed, and his chest rose and fell slowly. Emily felt a knot form in her throat. The man who had always seemed so strong now looked so fragile. Suddenly, all the pride, all the arguments, and unspoken words seemed insignificant. All she wanted was to be able to talk to him, to hold his hand and tell him she was there, that she was sorry for everything. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open gently, the creak of the hinges echoing through the room. John opened his eyes slowly, blinking, trying to understand who was entering. When his eyes met Emily's for a second, she saw surprise, and then something deeper. Perhaps relief, perhaps regret. She walked over slowly, her heart beating erratically. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice coming out as a whisper. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to smile. This was not the reunion she had imagined for so long, but it was a reunion she knew she had to face. And so, finally, after so many years, there they were, father and daughter, face to face, ready to face everything they had left unfinished together. Emily was now inside the room, standing by the hospital bed where her father, John, lay. The air was filled with the typical hospital scent, a mix of antiseptic, something metallic, and a sterile chill that made everything feel uncomfortable and impersonal. John was there, his skin pale and marked by time, his half-open eyes trying to focus on the daughter he hadn't seen in so long. For a moment, they just looked at each other without speaking. It was as if neither knew what to say or how to act. John looked surprised and perhaps a bit vulnerable, while Emily was trying to control the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. There was something about seeing her father like this, so fragile and exposed, that brought all the conflicting feelings to the surface. Old pride, long-held anger, but also love and the fear of losing him. "You came," John finally said, his voice weak and hoarse, but filled with an emotion he could not hide. Those two words were enough to make Emily's heart tighten. She nodded, feeling the tears threatening to spill, but forcing herself to stay composed. "Of course I came, Dad," Emily replied, trying to smile, though her face felt tense. She sat down in the small chair next to the bed, still not knowing how to start the conversation that needed to happen. There were so many things to say, so many things to clarify, but how could she put it all into words? The silence lingered for a few minutes, a kind of silence heavy with everything that had been left unsaid for years. Emily took her father's hand, which lay resting on the bed, and held it gently. He seemed surprised by the gesture, but did not pull away. His hands, once firm and calloused from carpentry, now felt thin and bony, as if they had lost all the strength she once knew. "I got the call and knew I needed to be here," Emily began, trying to break through the barrier of silence. "I know it's been a long time, but I've never stopped thinking about you." John took a deep breath and looked away. He seemed to want to say something, but hesitated, as if the words wouldn't come easily. Finally, he looked back at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but also a deep sadness. "I thought about you a lot, Emily," he said, pausing between each word as if each took immense effort. "It was never my intention. It was never my intention for us to be so distant." His voice, always so full of firmness and conviction, now sounded vulnerable, filled with regret. Emily didn't know how to respond. She felt a lump in her throat while a mix of sadness and relief swept through her. Hearing her father speak like this was something she had never expected. She had always thought he blamed her for everything, but now she realized he too carried the weight of guilt. "I thought about it a lot too," said Emily, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I regretted so many times leaving like that, not talking to you all this time. I just, I didn't know how to come back." John nodded slowly, closing his eyes for a moment. Emily's words seemed to hit a tender spot, something he had also carried within him. Behind all the pride and coldness he had always shown, there was a father who didn't know how to deal with the distance from his daughter, someone who had wanted to take the first step but had been unable to overcome his own limitations. "I always thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice trembling. "I just wanted the best for you, but I guess I never really understood you. You had your dreams and I was afraid." Emily looked at her father, her eyes finally releasing the tears she had been trying to hold back since she had entered that room. "I know, Dad. I know you wanted to protect me, and I was selfish too, thinking you only wanted to keep me here. But deep down, I think I just wanted you to believe in me." John breathed deeply, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. He turned his face, trying to hide his emotion. "I always believed in you, Emily. Maybe not in the way you wanted, but I believed in you. I just didn't know how to let you go." Those words felt like a release for Emily. For so long she had thought her father had never trusted her, that he only saw her as a child who didn't know what she was doing. Now she understood that all of that came from his fear of losing the only person he truly loved. John had always been a solitary man. After the death of his wife, Emily's mother, he never managed to open up to anyone else. All of his love was focused on his daughter, and the idea of letting her go seemed like a nightmare. Emily wiped away the tears running down her cheeks and smiled at him, a sincere but sad smile. "I was scared too, Dad. Scared of making the wrong choice. Scared that you'd never forgive me. But I'm here now. I'm here." John sighed as if releasing years of accumulated tension and squeezed his daughter's hand. There was no more anger, no more pride. There was only a father and a daughter trying to reconnect, trying to find what they had lost during all those years. It was the first time in a long time that they truly saw each other, without the mask that pride and resentment had created. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he said. And this time, it wasn't just an apology for the fight. It was an apology for all the moments he failed to understand who she was, for all the times his own insecurities and fears overshadowed the love he felt for her. "If I could go back, I would have supported you, let you follow your dreams without judging you." Emily shook her head, holding his hand even tighter. "The past is gone, Dad. What matters is that we are here now, and I want to stay with you as long as you need." John tried to smile, a smile that was both sad and full of relief. Emily could see the fragility in his eyes, something she had never seen before. He had always been so strong, so determined to be the rock of the family, that he had never allowed himself to be vulnerable. Seeing her father like this was painful, but it also gave her the opportunity to know him in a way she never had before. Time seemed to move slowly as they sat there, in silence. It was no longer a heavy, uncomfortable silence, but a silence of understanding. Emily held John's hand, feeling the connection slowly being rebuilt. There were so many things they still needed to say, but at that moment, words weren't necessary. Just being there was enough. Emily knew that their time together was uncertain, but she was determined not to waste a moment. She would stay, take care of John, and most of all, make sure he knew how much he meant to her. Even if the time was short, even if they couldn't make up for the years they had lost, they could still create something new, something that wasn't defined by the hurts of the past, but by the love that, despite everything, had always existed between them. The memories of the past were still there. The recollections of the good times and the arguments, the smiles and the shouts. But now, sitting side by side in that hospital room, Emily and John were ready to leave those voices from the past behind and create a new story. A story of forgiveness, acceptance, and love. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she wasn't lost anymore. She was exactly where she needed to be, beside her father. The silence that followed after John and Emily's first words of reconciliation seemed sacred. It was a type of silence that filled the room with the weight of what had finally been spoken. Emily looked at her father and saw the exhaustion in his eyes, his tired expression, but also the peace that was beginning to emerge. After so many years of hurt and unspoken words, sitting there by his side without needing to justify herself felt like a burden was being lifted from her shoulders. The hospital room, small and decorated with necessary medical equipment, had a heavy atmosphere, but also a comforting one. The light from the late afternoon came through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft, almost melancholy glow. Emily, holding John's hand, realized how precious that moment was. After everything she had been through, she was finally back by her father's side, and he, for the first time in a long while, was allowing her to see his most human, vulnerable side. "Do you remember the treehouse you built for me?" Emily asked, trying to ease the tension, bringing up a memory that was sweet to her. She wanted to make John smile, even if just a little. He was always so rigid and serious most of the time that his moments of lightness and tenderness were treasures etched in her memory. John closed his eyes for a moment, and a slight curve formed on his lips, a nostalgic smile. "Of course I remember, Emily. You insisted on painting the boards every possible color. The house turned out very colorful." He chuckled softly, and the memory seemed to warm the room. It was an echo of a time when things seemed simpler, when there was just a father and a daughter exploring the world together. Emily smiled, recalling how he had let her choose the colors, even though they were all different. The little house had one green wall, another yellow, a blue window, and another red. She knew that for John, the end result probably didn't make much aesthetic sense, but he had allowed her to create without imposing limits. She had forgotten that detail for a long time, the way he sometimes let her be free to be who she wanted to be, even if he didn't fully understand. As the sun set, casting an orange hue over the room, a nurse entered to check on John's vitals. She greeted Emily with a warm smile, and Emily could see how attentive the staff was. John seemed at ease amid the medical routine, as if he was finally accepting the help he had always refused. Emily thought that perhaps her father was ready to deal with his own vulnerability, something he had always feared. The nurse finished her work quickly and left the room, leaving Emily and John alone again. She noticed how pale her father was compared to his robust, sunburnt complexion when he worked in the carpentry shop. He seemed like a different man now, as if all the strength and energy had been drained by the years and the weight of his illness. She knew she couldn't change what had happened, couldn't make up for lost time, but somehow that hospital room had become the most important place in the world because it was where they had the chance to reconnect. "You've been working as an artist, haven't you?" John asked suddenly, his voice full of curiosity, but also fatigue. Emily felt her heart tighten, realizing he was trying to show interest in her life, trying to connect with a dream he hadn't understood before. Emily nodded, smiling. "Yes, I'm working as an illustrator. It's not easy, but I've gotten some interesting projects, mainly for children's books. It's, it's what I always wanted to do, you know, to tell stories through my drawings, to make children dream." John smiled slightly, his eyes seeming to brighten for a moment. "I always knew you had talent, Emily. I think I never said it enough. I never really knew how, to be honest." Emily felt a lump in her throat at those words. They were the words she had always wanted to hear, but had never dared to ask for. It was as if, suddenly, that hole in her heart caused by the need for her father's approval was beginning to close. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, felt a kind of inner peace. Her father was there, acknowledging her worth, even if it was years later, even in that vulnerable moment. "I knew you were scared, Dad," said Emily, holding his hand more firmly. "I was scared too. Maybe deep down, we were always afraid of the same thing, losing each other." John closed his eyes and a solitary tear escaped down the side of his face. He had always been a man who rarely showed emotions, always preferring to keep them to himself. Now, however, there was no more reason to hide what he truly felt. The tears were a reflection of everything he had never been able to say. "I should have let you follow your own path without fighting it so much," he said, his voice shaky. "I thought I was protecting you, But in reality, I was just pushing you away." Emily leaned in even closer, tears streaming down her cheeks, and kissed her father's forehead. "Don't think about that now, Dad. What matters is that you always loved me and tried to protect me. I understand that now, and I'm here. We're together, and that's all that matters." She could feel John's hand squeezing hers, though weakly. There was effort there, an effort to connect, to make it clear that he understood and accepted the moment. Emily lay gently beside him on the bed, still holding his hand. She wanted him to know that he wasn't alone, that no matter what happened from then on, they were together. The following minutes were filled with a profound silence, a silence that needed no words. Emily could hear her father's irregular breathing and felt every movement of his chest rising and falling. Those were the last memories she would have of him, and somehow that felt right. There were no more arguments, no more grudges or resentments. There was only love, pure and unconditional, as it should have been from the beginning. John, with difficulty, turned his head slightly toward Emily. "I always knew that you'd do amazing things. I just didn't know how to tell you that," he said, his voice almost fading, but filled with sincerity that Emily would never forget. She closed her eyes, squeezing his hand tighter, as if trying to pass all her energy, all her strength to him. "Thank you, Dad. I've always wanted to hear that. You don't know how much it means to me." That exchange was their last meaningful conversation. John then closed his eyes and seemed to relax. Emily felt as if he had finally found peace, as if all the weight he had carried for years had been lifted. She remained by his side, still holding his hand, watching as his breathing became increasingly slow. Time passed slowly, and Emily didn't even notice when the sky outside the hospital began to darken again. Everything around her dissolved into a blur, the sounds of the corridors, the lights going out in other rooms, the distant chatter of the nurses. Everything seemed distant, irrelevant. Her world was concentrated in that room, in her father's presence, in the connection they had finally managed to restore. Shortly after sunset, Emily noticed that John's breathing had become so faint that she could barely hear it. She held his hand more firmly and leaned forward, realizing the moment was near. Tears flowed freely now, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of farewell, of love, of relief. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm here. You can rest now." And then, as if he had been waiting for that moment, John took his last breath, a deep breath that seemed to release all the tension and sorrow of an entire lifetime. Emily felt when his hand, which had been holding hers, slowly relaxed. The constant beep of the machines turned into a continuous monotone. Emily's heart clenched and a deep pain hit her, but at the same time, there was a sense of serenity. John was gone, but he had left in peace. Knowing that his daughter was by his side, she knew at that moment that, no matter what happened, he knew he was loved, and she knew he loved her too, in his own imperfect way. The nurses entered the room in silence, turning off the machines, and offered Emily a few words of comfort. She, however, couldn't leave her father's side just yet. The pain of the loss was immense, a void that seemed to tear her chest apart. But there was also an acceptance. They had reconciled. They had said everything that needed to be said. John had left knowing he was loved, and Emily knew that he loved her too. Emily stood up slowly and kissed her father's forehead one last time, feeling the cold touch of his skin. "Thank you for everything, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "For all the moments, even the difficult ones. I will never forget what you did for me." When she finally left the hospital, Emily felt drained, as if every emotion had been pulled from within her. But there was a lightness as well, something she hadn't felt in years. Walking along the empty street, she looked up at the night sky, where a few stars shone, and felt a connection to something greater. Perhaps her father was there now, somewhere, finally free of his pain and regrets. She went home alone, but with the feeling that John would always be with her. All the years of hurt, all the unspoken words, now seemed small compared to the love that remained. The last embrace, the last words, the look of recognition. Those were what mattered. In the end, it was love that prevailed. And so, on that dark, cold night, Emily entered the house and sat again in John's armchair, hugging a pillow. She felt a melancholy peace, but a genuine peace. She knew that from then on she would continue to live and honor her father's legacy. That man who was never perfect, but who always loved her in his flawed way. She allowed herself to cry a little more, knowing that those tears were, above all, a farewell, but also a new beginning. The next morning, Emily woke up early in her childhood home, still surrounded by an environment that held so many memories. The curtains let the morning sunlight slowly enter, bathing the living room in a soft, almost mournful glow. She rose from the armchair, where she had fallen asleep, and went to the kitchen, feeling the cold floor under her bare feet. Every corner of the house seemed to scream memories of a life that no longer existed in the same way. The laughter at breakfast, the short conversations, the smell of the coffee John would make every morning. Emily knew she had to prepare herself for whatever the day would bring. She took a quick shower and put on something comfortable. This wasn't a day to worry about appearances. All she wanted was to get back to the hospital, see her father, and be by his side for as long as possible. When she arrived at the hospital, the environment was busier than the day before. Nurses moved back and forth, doctors discussed medical charts, and some patients walked the corridors, assisted by family members or staff. Emily went straight to room 312, her mind focused only on being with John. Upon opening the door, she found her father sleeping. He looked even more fragile than the day before. His gray hair was spread across the pillow, and his breathing was slow and irregular. The constant beep of the machine monitoring his vital signs echoed through the room, creating an unsettling sense of urgency. Emily sat by his bedside and held his hand, feeling the weak warmth that still emanated from his fingers. She stayed there for a while, just watching her father sleep. Those minutes felt like hours, as if time had slowed down to give her more space to reflect on everything they had been through. Emily remembered the good moments they had before the argument. The afternoons in the carpentry shop, the short trips to the lake where they would fish together, the stories he used to tell her before bed when she was little. Each of these memories helped her see her father as a man who, despite his flaws, had always tried to be the best father he could be. Suddenly, John opened his eyes slowly. He seemed disoriented for a moment until his eyes focused on Emily. She leaned in closer and smiled. "Hi, Dad. I'm here." John tried to smile, a weak smile that barely masked his exhaustion, but it carried a look of relief. "Emily." His voice was just a whisper, so low she had to lean in further to hear him. "You came back." Emily squeezed his hand. "Of course I came back. I'm going to stay with you, as long as you need me." John nodded and breathed deeply, as if trying to gather strength. "I wanted to say so many things to you," he began, the words coming out slowly, as if each took enormous effort. "But I think the most important, you already know." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes and she just nodded. "I know, Dad. I know you always loved me. And I want you to know that I love you too, very much." Her father closed his eyes for a moment, a tear running down his pale cheek. It was a painful sight, seeing this man who had always been so strong, now so vulnerable. But Emily knew that vulnerability was also a way to reconnect, to finally let love triumph over all fears and resentments. "I wish I had done things differently," John murmured, his voice failing. "I wish I had supported you more, been by your side instead of trying to hold you back." Emily leaned in even closer and, with tears running down her cheeks, kissed her father's forehead. "Don't think about that now, Dad. What matters is that you always loved me and tried to protect me. I understand that now, and I'm here. We're together, and that's all that matters." She could feel John's hand squeezing hers, though it was weak. There was an effort there, an effort to connect, to make it clear that he understood and accepted the moment. Emily lay gently beside him on the bed, still holding his hand. She wanted him to know that he wasn't alone, that no matter what happened from then on, they were together. The following minutes were filled with a profound silence, a silence that needed no words. Emily could hear her father's irregular breathing, and felt every movement of his chest rising and falling. Those were the last memories she would have of him, and somehow that felt right. There were no more arguments, no more grudges or resentments. There was only love, pure and unconditional, as it should have been from the beginning. John, with difficulty, turned his head slightly toward Emily. "I always knew that you'd do amazing things. I just didn't know how to tell you that," he said, his voice almost fading, but filled with sincerity that Emily would never forget. She closed her eyes, squeezing his hand tighter, as if trying to pass all her energy, all her strength to him. "Thank you, Dad. I've always wanted to hear that. You don't know how much it means to me." That exchange was their last meaningful conversation. John then closed his eyes and seemed to relax. Emily felt as if he had finally found peace, as if all the weight he had carried for years had been lifted. She remained by his side, still holding his hand, watching as his breathing became increasingly slow. Time passed slowly, and Emily didn't even notice when the sky outside the hospital began to darken again. Everything around her dissolved into a blur. The sounds of the corridors, the lights going out in other rooms, the distant chatter of the nurses. Everything seemed distant, irrelevant. Her world was concentrated in that room, in her father's presence, in the connection they had finally managed to restore. Shortly after sunset, Emily noticed that John's breathing had become so faint that she could barely hear it. She held his hand more firmly and leaned forward, realizing the moment was near. Tears flowed freely now, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of farewell, of love, of relief. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm here. You can rest now." And then, as if he had been waiting for that moment, John took his last breath, a deep breath that seemed to release all the tension and sorrow of an entire lifetime. Emily felt when his hand, which had been holding hers, slowly relaxed. The constant beep of the machines turned into a continuous monotone. Emily's heart clenched and a deep pain hit her, but at the same time, there was a sense of serenity. John was gone, but he had left in peace, knowing that his daughter was by his side. She knew at that moment that, no matter what happened, he knew he was loved, and she knew he loved her too, in his own imperfect way. The nurses entered the room in silence, turning off the machines, and offered Emily a few words of comfort. She, however, couldn't leave her father's side just yet. The pain of the loss was immense, a void that seemed to tear her chest apart. But there was also an acceptance. They had reconciled. They had said everything that needed to be said. John had left knowing he was loved, and Emily knew that he loved her too. Emily stood up slowly and kissed her father's forehead one last time, feeling the cold touch of his skin. "Thank you for everything, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "For all the moments, even the difficult ones. I will never forget what you did for me." When she finally left the hospital, Emily felt drained, as if every emotion had been pulled from within her. But there was a lightness as well, something she hadn't felt in years. Walking along the empty street, she looked up at the night sky, where a few stars shone, and felt a connection to something greater. Perhaps her father was there now, somewhere, finally free of his pain and regrets. She went home alone, but with the feeling that John would always be with her. All the years of hurt, all the unspoken words, now seemed small compared to the love that remained. The last embrace, the last words, the look of recognition, those were what mattered. In the end, it was love that prevailed. And so, on that dark, cold night, Emily entered the house and sat again in John's armchair, hugging a pillow. She felt a melancholy peace, but a genuine peace. She knew that, from then on, she would continue to live and honor her father's legacy. That man who was never perfect, but who always loved her in his flawed way. She allowed herself to cry a little more, knowing that those tears were, above all, a farewell, but also a new beginning. John's funeral took place 3 days after his death. It was a cold and gray morning, with a light mist hanging over the small town in Ohio. Emily woke up with a heavy heart, the weight of the farewell pressing on her. She knew it would be one of the hardest days of her life, but she also knew she needed to be strong, for her father and for herself. At the local cemetery, longtime friends, neighbors, and a few distant relatives gathered around the simple wooden coffin, built by one of John's colleagues, who was also a carpenter. It was a coffin made with care and affection, something that reflected the nature of the work John had always valued, something solid, made with respect. Emily, amidst the murmurs and tears of those gathered, realized how much her father had touched other people's lives, even though he had never considered himself an important man. She stood next to the coffin, holding a small white flower. Her eyes were swollen, but her mind was calm. The priest began the ceremony, speaking about John's life, about his hard work, his dedication to his craft, and the love he had for his daughter. Emily listened intently, letting each word sink into her heart as she remembered every detail of her life with her father. When it was time for her to say goodbye, Emily stepped forward. She felt everyone's eyes on her, but at that moment, nothing mattered except what she needed to say to her father, even if he was no longer physically there to hear it. She took a deep breath, looking at the wooden coffin in front of her. "My father was a man of few words, but many actions," Emily began, her voice initially trembling, but gaining strength as she spoke. "He always did what he could to take care of me, and even when he didn't understand my dreams, he never stopped loving me. It took years for me to understand that, and even though we drifted apart for a while, I know that deep down, our love never ceased to exist." She paused, tears already flowing down her face. "They weren't easy years. Many times I missed him, but I didn't know how to come back. And yet my father taught me never to give up, to fight for my dreams, even if he didn't know how to express it. What matters is that we managed to find each other in the end, and I know he left in peace. And that, for me, is everything." Emily looked at the coffin, and a gentle breeze passed over her face, like an invisible embrace. She placed the flower on the lid and whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for everything." She returned to her place and the ceremony continued. Everyone present approached to offer their condolences, shaking Emily's hand, saying words of comfort, talking about John's kindness and how he was a man everyone respected. Many recalled the times he had fixed something for them without charging, or how he always had a kind word, even if brief and direct. After the funeral, Emily returned to the house where she had grown up. The living room was silent, only the sound of the wind against the windows and the occasional noises of cars on the street. She walked into her father's room, a space that had always been private, a territory she didn't dare enter as a child. There she found John's tools carefully arranged, wood pieces stacked up, and a few unfinished projects, like the jewelry box he had begun to make for her when she was young. Emily picked up the unfinished wooden box and brought it to the living room. It was a simple piece, but there was something deeply meaningful about it. It was a gift he had never had the chance to finish. It was as if it represented their relationship, something beautiful but left incomplete for so long until they had finally managed to reconnect. She decided to finish the box. Perhaps it was a way to say goodbye more completely, a way to turn her pain into something tangible. She spent hours that afternoon sanding the wood, adjusting the parts, exactly as her father had taught her when she was a child. Each sanding, each nail she adjusted, made her feel more connected to him, as if he were there, guiding her once again. As she worked, Emily remembered the times she would sit next to John in the carpentry shop, watching as he measured, cut, and built something from scratch. She had always admired him for that, his ability to create something out of nothing, his care for every detail. Now with her own hands, Emily was finishing his last creation, and each part of the process seemed like a tribute to the man who, despite everything, had always loved her and tried to protect her. When she finished, the box was beautiful in its simplicity. It was something that John would have approved of. Emily opened the lid and, with a shy smile, placed one of their photos inside, a picture of her as a child, sitting on her father's lap as he held her small hands, teaching her to hammer a piece of wood. It was the symbol of everything they had been through together, the lessons, the silent affection, and the love that, in the end, overcame all the differences. A few days later, Emily returned to New York, carrying the box and the memories with her. Everything seemed different now. The city was as noisy and bustling as ever, but inside something had changed. She no longer felt burdened by the hurt and pride that had always followed her. She felt free to move forward, knowing that she had reconciled with her father and that he, at last, understood and accepted who she was. Emily returned to her studio and placed the jewelry box on a shelf in a place of honor where she could always see it while she worked. Now, more than ever, she felt her art had a deeper purpose. Each drawing, each story she told through her illustrations was a way to honor the love and lessons her father had left her. She continued her work as an illustrator, diving into projects that brought her ideas to life and trying, through each color and line, to convey some of the love she had finally managed to express. Emily decided she would create a series of illustrations dedicated to childhood memories, to afternoons in the garden, adventures in the treehouse, nights under the stars she spent with her father. She wanted the children who saw her illustrations to feel the love she had felt, even in the hard moments. One day, while finishing one of her projects, Emily received a phone call from a publisher interested in publishing a book with her illustrations. The book was about reconciliation, about families who, despite difficulties, found a way to come together. The proposal moved her deeply, as if the universe was giving her an opportunity to share her own story in some way. She accepted the project, feeling it was something her father would be proud of. As time went on, Emily felt she was finding a new purpose. It wasn't just about being an artist, but about using her art to touch people, to tell stories that could make a difference. She thought of her father every day, felt his absence, but also knew he was there with her in some way, in every line she drew, in every moment of inspiration. The jewelry box on the shelf was a constant reminder of his legacy. It wasn't just an object, but a symbol of forgiveness, love, and acceptance. Something that helped her remember that it's never too late to reconcile. It's never too late to say, "I love you," or "I'm sorry." The words she and John shared at the end of his life were more powerful than anything else. And now she knew her work was to spread that message of love and redemption to the world. Emily was finally at peace with herself. She had faced her fears, faced the pains of the past, and in the process had found a new way of living. A way of living that honored her father, his memory, and everything he had taught her about the value of simple things, about effort, and about love, even when it wasn't expressed in the most obvious way. Life went on, and Emily knew she would still face many challenges, but now she carried with her the certainty that she was no longer alone. John, in spirit and in memory, would always be by her side, and she would continue his legacy, one line at a time, one drawing at a time, always driven by the love that, in the end, was stronger than anything else. If you like this story of love, reconciliation, and forgiveness, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this. True love can heal even the deepest wounds, and we all need a little inspiration in our lives. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our videos, and if this story touched your heart, share it with someone special. It might be exactly the message they need to hear today. Comment below. What would you do to reconcile with someone important in your life? Let's talk about it.